By early 1945, Allied and Soviet armies stood at the borders of the German Reich in the east and in the west. For the Anglo-American forces, the main strategic problem to solve before they could break into the heart of Germany was the crossing of the Rhine River. The Rhine was the last major natural obstacle facing the British, Canadian, and U.S. armies. But even though the Wehrmacht was badly weakened and the Luftwaffe a shell of its former self, the task would not be easy. The Nazi leadership promised fierce resistance, but the Allies planned to attack with overwhelming force, including the biggest single-day airborne assault of the entire war. In February 1945, the Western Allies were suffering from logistical difficulties. The supply lines between their bases in England and the front lines in Holland and Germany were hundreds of kilometers long and made even more complicated since most continental ports were in ruins. Their troops, especially the infantry, were exhausted after a difficult series of battles in the fall and winter, and the British and Canadians were still recovering from a replacement shortage in late 1944. This meant that despite their superiority in numbers, heavy weapons, and virtual air supremacy, the Allies did not feel that they had the resources for a major offensive along the entire length of the front. After difficult and sometimes bitter negotiations, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower decided that the main effort to break into Germany would be made by General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the northern Rhineland, where the land was flat and ripe for mobile warfare in the North German plain. American generals Bradley and Patton were livid, but for the moment, the priority would be elsewhere. 21st Army Group launched its offensive to reach the Rhine River on February 8, 1945. This army group included 2nd British Army, 1st Canadian Army, which was mostly British, and the U.S. 9th Army. The planned breakthrough to seize an intact bridge at Basel never came, and 1st Canadian Army took weeks of grueling fighting to slowly push back the Germans. Once the floodwaters went down, 9th U.S. Army joined them, and together they forced the Germans back across the river by March 10th. But the Germans managed to withdraw and blow the last bridges. Field Marshal Montgomery decided to wait until detailed preparations could be finished before attempting to cross the river. Monty's style of generalship was based on careful planning before any attack, partly since the Brits and Canadians under his command could not afford heavy losses. He's been roundly criticized by contemporaries and historians for being too cautious and slow, ultimately not taking full advantage of opportunities as they presented themselves. Some suggest that he wanted to avoid another failure like the one in Operation Market Garden at Arnhem in fall 1944. U.S. 9th Army Commander General Bill Simpson wanted to continue the momentum and cross the Rhine while the Germans were still attempting to recover from their defeats west of the river. But Monty said no. Meanwhile, south of 21st Army Group, U.S. generals who resented being forced to accept limitations on their offensive moves took the initiative anyway. On March 7th, 1st U.S. Army troops surprised the Germans defending the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine at Rhey-Martin and captured it in working conditions. On March 22nd, General George Patton began ferrying his men across the river at Unheim and took great pleasure in having beaten his rival Monty to the punch. These American units were across the Rhine, but the rough terrain on the east bank and German reinforcements from the north limited their progress for now. Montgomery's plan for the main crossing was twofold. On March 23rd, Operation Plunder would see ground forces cross after a massive artillery bombardment. Followed the morning of the 24th by Operation Varsity, 16,000 Allied paratroopers and glider infantry, the largest airborne drop in a single day of the entire war. The paratroopers would secure the area immediately in front of the ground troops who were crossing the river. And once the two linked up, the Allies could dash across the flatlands into the Ruhr industrial area and beyond, perhaps even to Berlin. In Montgomery's words, the intention is to cross the Rhine north of the Ruhr and secure a firm bridgehead with a view to developing operations to isolate the Ruhr and to penetrate deeper into Germany. In all, 1.22 million Allied troops and 5,000 guns were to participate in the crossing and breakthrough into the North German plain. The German First Parachute Army defending the northern Rhine had been reduced to a mere 85,000 men, 1,000 guns, and fewer than 120 tanks. As the armies were preparing for battle in the village of Hamink on the Rhine's east bank, 83-year-old Sophie Becke confided her worries to her diary. "We are not defeated. Germany still has the Rhine and it has always protected us. I pray to God that it protects us now in our hour of need. Perhaps the Americans will fail." Operation Plunder began on the evening of March 23, 1945. Winston Churchill, General Eisenhower, and Field Marshal Alan Brooke all gathered on a nearby hill to watch the historic moment unfold in person. Allied troops were understandably anxious, so one British officer found these words to reassure his men. "If you happen to hear a few stray bullets, you needn't think they're intended for you. That, gentlemen, is a form of egotism." Following aerial bombing, British, Canadian, and American guns put down a hail of fire on German positions for 4 hours to destroy as many defensive positions as possible so the vulnerable infantry could cross. Surprised German artillery officer Oberst Fenella sprang into action. We were sitting around a bottle of cognac, which was the only thing that could somewhat calm our nerves. Suddenly, there was a crash, and then all hell broke loose. And without saying anything, we all knew the time had come. Unbelievably heavy fire was falling on the little town. Even though we had to lay low due to the unrelenting enemy fire, we began firing onto the bank opposite Rays. This success earned us even more enemy shells on my positions, and soon the batteries reported their first losses. The 51st Highland Division crossed opposite the town of Rhine, 15th Scottish south of that, and the 1st British Commando Brigade landed just north of Vasil before turning south to take the ruins of the bombed-out town. The U.S. 79th and 30th Divisions made their crossings on the southern end of the line between Vasil and Dinslac. This initial wave was followed by a Canadian brigade including my grandfather's unit, more British and American infantry, and the all-important armored divisions. Opposing the Allied forces were 2 German infantry divisions and 2 Phalam divisions, all badly depleted, and the remnants of the 15th Panzer Grenadier and 116th Panzer divisions in close reserve. Although German Army Group H Commander General Johannes Blasco committed his panzers quite early, Allied troops quickly consolidated their bridgeheads. The Highlanders took race by the end of March 24th, but their commanding general, Tom Rhine, was killed. After a dramatic crossing near the ruins of a destroyed railway bridge that can still be seen today, the commando secured the wasteland of Vasil. The fighting in Vasil was bitter and cost the life of German General Alfred Deutsch. There are conflicting stories about the circumstances of Deutsch's death, one of which stems from British commando Philip Pritchard. In the middle of the battle, passing through Vasil, we found a commando lance corporal digging a grave in a garden. This seemed strange, and we asked him why he was doing it. He said his section had been searching a house when they were confronted by a German officer. The lance corporal immediately said, "Hands up," but the German replied, "I am General Deutsch, and will only surrender to an officer of equal rank." The lance corporal was fed up with all this and said, "Well, this will equalize you," and fired his Tommy gun at the general with fatal results. Brigadier Mills Roberts was furious, and as a punishment, he ordered the lance corporal to bury the general. The 2 U.S. divisions faced little serious opposition, partly due to German weakness, but also to the 1,000 shells per minute that they lobbed onto German positions in the hour before the crossing. The Americans only took 30 casualties on the 24th, including the unfortunate men who died of hypothermia when their boat overturned and plunged them into the frigid Rhine. By the afternoon, the 30th Division was no longer facing organized resistance in its sector. The Rhine defenses had been breached first by the Americans at Remagen, but now the Allies were across in force. Engineers worked feverishly to throw across more and more bridges, and soon Allied tanks, trucks, and artillery began to roll across the Rhine to support the infantry and break through remaining German defenses. By the end of March 24th, the Allied bridgehead was 40 kilometers long and 10 kilometers deep. Operation Plunder was going according to plan, and soon Allied armor, supplies, and infantry reinforcements were streaming across the river on freshly laid bridges. Just ahead of them, German troops already had their hands full with the largest airborne drop of any day in the entire war. Operation Varsity began on March 24th at 10 a.m. A fleet of British and American aircraft roared over the Rhine, carrying 16,000 British, American, and Canadian troops. The 1,700 transport planes, 1,348 gliders, and an escort of 900 fighters to make sure that they reached their destination. What the fighters offered little protection from was flak. German anti-aircraft fire poured shells into the air, and the relatively slow-moving transports and gliders suffered very heavy losses in the air. To servicemen sitting in the slow-moving aircraft like U.S. serviceman Jack Ariola, it seemed like they were completely defenseless. The anti-aircraft fire was so thick, I believe we could have got out and walked on it. Bullets and flak were coming through the glider, and every time one hit the bottom of the glider and went out through the top, it sounded like the crack of a whip, only 10 times louder. Very demoralizing. German Lieutenant Leitner was in command of a 20mm anti-aircraft battery below. With so many aircraft, it was difficult not to hit something. I ordered my men to keep firing in the hope that by filling the sky with metal, some of it would do some damage. Now, before we move on to the action on the ground, if you want to learn more about the aerial component of Operation Varsity, you should check out the Military Aviation History channel, where Chris explores the airborne aspects of the operation in much greater detail. We can't recommend his videos enough. And if you're even remotely interested in military aviation, definitely check out his channel. Anyway, back to Operation Varsity. The men of the 6th British and 17th U.S. Airborne Divisions dropped or glided onto 10 landing zones to capture the high ground along the river, is before linking up with the ground troops advancing from the Rhine. Many of the gliders crash-landed, causing further losses before the men could fire a shot in anger. One of them was 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Nicolet, whose body was later found hanging from a tree. A major stepped into his place, and the Canadians fought on, not knowing Nicolet's fate. Some units, like the U.S. 57th Parachute Regiment near Diasport Forest, dropped in the wrong place and had to first orient themselves before they were able to move on their objectives. The fighting around the village of Hamink and the nearby Diasport Forest was intense, but once the Allied troops managed to get organized, they overwhelmed the outnumbered German defenders. They didn't have as many heavy weapons as regular ground troops, but the gliders did bring all sorts of heavier kit: jeeps, trucks, bulldozers, universal carriers, mortars, anti-tank guns, and even the M22 Locust light tank. Hemmink soon fell to the British, but the Ox and Bucks Regiment ran into trouble trying to hold a bridge over the River Islam. General Blasco sent in the 116th Panzer Division from the reserve, but it was a division in name only. Still, the few tanks the Germans had caused trouble to the more lightly armed Brits. They had to abandon the bridge and blow it up to prevent further German progress. The Canadians also had a tough fight on their hands. Medical orderly Corporal Frederick Topham saw 2 other medics killed as they tried to treat a wounded man lying in the open. Topham ran out and began to treat the casualty when he himself was shot through the nose. In spite of severe bleeding and intense pain, he never faltered in his task. Having completed immediate first aid, he carried the wounded man steadily and slowly back through continuous fire to the shelter of a wood. During the next 2 hours, Corporal Topham worked to bring in wounded, showing complete disregard for the heavy and accurate enemy fire. On his way back to his company, he came across a carrier which had received a direct hit. Enemy mortar bombs were still dropping around. The carrier itself was burning fiercely, and its own mortar ammunition was exploding. Corporal Topham, however, immediately went out alone and rescued the 3 occupants of the carrier. Although one died almost immediately afterwards, he arranged for the evacuation of the other 2 who undoubtedly owe their lives to him. Topham received the Victoria Cross, and he was not the only Allied soldier to win his country's highest decoration that day, as 2 U.S. servicemen were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions in Operation Varsity. In the days following the drop, the Allies pushed east. British and American troops linked up with the paratroopers on March 25th, the same day that Winston Churchill insisted on crossing the Rhine himself, even though it was still within range of German guns who dropped a few shells in the area. As Churchill's visit was recorded for newsreels around the world, a German artillery observer in nearby Emmer made a brief note in his diary. From yesterday evening until this morning, again, heavy barrage in our area, artillery attacks. Also, particularly heavy fighter-bomber activity and aerial observation. Untroubled by man's futile efforts, nature graced this Sunday with glorious spring sunshine. Operations Plunder and Varsity had achieved their objectives of securing a major Rhine crossing for the Allies, but they've been the subject of controversy. Critics have argued that Operation Varsity incurred excessive expenses, suggesting that the same objectives could have been accomplished by ground troops advancing from the river with fewer casualties against the already weakened German forces. The airborne drop occurred during daylight hours. Many American aviators were inexperienced in towing gliders, and the newly introduced C-46 transport aircraft were deficient in self-sealing fuel systems, making them more susceptible to ignition upon being struck. Nonetheless, some, including General Eisenhower, advocated for the operation, emphasizing that the troops achieved success. The drops were more precise compared to earlier airborne missions, and German artillery positions were neutralized more swiftly. Regardless, by March 28th, the German resistance on the eastern bank of the river confronting the 21st Army Group had diminished to scattered groups, and Allied forces had freed the infamous forced labor camp at Rhine. Further down the line, American units expanded their bridgeheads, and the remnants of the once formidable Wehrmacht were in retreat along the western front. The Rhine had been successfully traversed. Allied armored divisions were advancing rapidly to encircle the Ruhr and penetrate central Germany. Churchill noted during dinner, "The German is beaten." Although combat would continue for another arduous and bloody month, the final grand engagement of World War II in the West had concluded.